One of the issues that comes up when we're dealing with, sorry about that, we're dealing with the new city and the massive amount of people that are streaming into London, is transportation. How are people going to get around? How are people going? How are they going to manage this massive amount of horses and trains, and then the onslaught of cars, etc.? And an additional problem is that in London at the time, and this was the full extent, again, you see the city in the very center. You get the different parts of the city of London at this point, Westminster, which I pointed to you, etc. You have more and more people moving into the city because every red dot you see is a factory. So within the actual city of London, there was this many factories during the 1800s. And it just kept getting more and more. And you can see, especially around Bloomsbury down to the river, extremely densely packed with factories. Then we see, and again along the Regent's Canal to the north. But you can also imagine, or need to imagine, that England, and especially London, often experience a westerly wind that comes from the west, moves to the east, because they're at the tail end of the Gulf Stream. So the prevailing winds in England are from west to east. And so when you move to the city, or you live in the city of London, then imagine if you live on this side, Bethnal Green, Stepney, etc., all of the smoke being belched out of these different factories are going to come and settle over you, because it's being blown that way. And so to this day, the West End, Shepherd's Bush, these are the expensive areas to live. This is why Queen Victoria settled on this side. The Queen still lives on this side. It's not because they made anything better over here than anywhere else, except the smog and the smoke and the soot from all of the different factories. And so the wealthy area became the western end of the city and everything else. So you can imagine that Stepney, Bethnal Green, these were areas where most of the factory workers lived. So they would go and experience the factory all day long, work in the factory, and then go home and still have the factory belching out smoke and soot, which then becomes a constant fog over the city. And that's why for many years we considered London fog as a stereotype of the city. Now, because if I were to, and I don't have one, but if I were to show you a map of the number of factories within the city of London, it would be 0. They've all been moved out into suburbs further away, and spread out so that air pollution is not as much of a problem. They also moved away from coal and other things that would create pollution. Additionally, look at all of the number of factories. They needed people to work in them. And so they needed to get people who could get to the city. And if you lived outside of the city of London, just nearby, though, if you lived over here or over in this area, again, it was cheaper to live, but you needed to get into the city to work. So that was a problem. Transportation was a problem. And so that's why, historically, London is the first city to develop a subway system. And they hired people to come in, and they would literally dig out the trenches, and almost all of their subways follow along the road, because they would dig up a road, dig deep enough to put a subway tunnel in, then they would cover it up. It's called a cut and cover method. It's still used today because it's an effective way, but now that in most cities it's so dense, they often will use tunnels, boring machines, etc. But some places still use the cut and cover method. But this also developed London into a few more broader streets. They would need to tear down a few buildings in order to be able to dig something this wide. Then they would cover it up, and new buildings could go over it in some places. Some places the roads were widened. So different use in different parts of the city. And to see how this really works, in, for us, kind of real life terms. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures which illustrate this fact. This picture was taken in 1917 in Queens, New York, right outside of Manhattan, New York City. 1917. This subway station was built out into the suburbs to bring people into Manhattan to work, and also allow people, because Manhattan was becoming more and more dense, this way they could move out and settle these far-flung areas and still be able to get to work every day. So 1917, about 150 years ago for us, look at part of New York. When we think of New York, we think of skyscrapers, wall-to-wall buildings, completely desolate area. This is the same area today, where it says M toward the middle of the screen. That is that same subway station. And you can see not much land around it now. You still have the streets on two sides, which are built up, but again, a massive amount of building. And I'm just going to then zoom out of this to show you a little bit bigger area. The X now is that subway mark. So again, in that first picture, everything was just dirt. And then if I zoom out even further to show you, on the left, this is Manhattan, Central Park. And you can see just covered with buildings. Then the X is still the subway line. You can see, other than a few cemeteries and parks that were built around it, Queens is now almost completely building next to building. And that's only happened within the last 150 years. So we've seen massive growth in the U.S. in the same way in very recent times. It just happened to happen like this in London in the 1800s, and for us in New York in the 1900s. But it's the same thing that's happened. And here we have the photographic evidence. We didn't have the photographic evidence of London as it grew up. Okay, now we're going to talk about housing, and I'll start that in the next lecture.